Hello, this is Charles Brewer, President of the Civil War Study Group at Lake of the Woods, Virginia. Welcome to the recording of our program for the date shown. Also, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for coming today. And we do have our programs set up for next year, at least the first 7 months of next year. So I would invite you to visit our website. We have a programs page on the website menu. So look at that and see the programs for 2022. One of the changes that we're making in the programs is that we're returning the annual dinner to the May timeframe to coincide with the Battle of the Wilderness. And we do have a speaker lined up for that. You'll see the details on our programs page of the website. And also, as many of you may have already seen our email that we sent out today with an attached article from the Freelance Star talking about a new monument in the Stevensburg area off Calico Road. Well, actually, Madden's Tavern Road off of Calico Road, west of here. So without any further ado, let me introduce our speaker. I actually saw a review of his book, Fire in the Wilderness, and decided, well, that's an interesting topic. Let me order this. And I read the book and wish that I could get his autograph on the book, but I bought the digital version. So, there you go. I can't do anything about that. So our speaker today is John Reeves. And he's been interested in history since his youth. And he's had articles on Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the History News, and also on the History News Network. Earlier in his career, he taught European and American history at various colleges in Chicago, the Bronx, and London. He graduated Phi Beta Kappa with a BA in economics from Syracuse University in 1984. Later, he received an MA in European history from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst and pursued a PhD in history at the University of Illinois in Chicago. And his dissertation was on Britain's role in Persia in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And throughout his career, he's tried to make history lively and accessible for students and general readers. Over the years, he has taught European and American history at Lehman College, Bronx College, Community College, and South Bank University in London. He lives in Washington, D.C. With his wife and 2 children, and is about making history lively and accessible for students. Reading his book, I believe I can say that he has done a good job of that. All right, so John, if you would do the share screen and begin your presentation.
All right. Why don't we get started, and I'll be able to. We'll just figure it out as we go along. That's fine. Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm happy to be here, and basically what we'll talk about today is obviously the Battle of the Wilderness, and I'm going to say a few things about my book, A Fire in the Wilderness. In particular, I think I'm going to spend some time talking about why I wrote the book, first of all, and then we'll look a little bit at the clash between Lee and Grant, who faced one another for the first time in the wilderness. And then we'll look at the experiences of ordinary soldiers during the fighting. I know this group has a pretty good understanding of what happened in the wilderness, so I don't want to get into sort of the details so much as I want to share some impressions of the fight, and also think about how the wilderness has been remembered over time. As you all know, the Battle of the Wilderness occurred on May 5th and 6th, 1864. In his memoirs, Grant wrote, "More desperate fighting has not been witnessed on this continent than that of the 5th and 6th of May." So on the 4th of May, Grant had crossed the Rapidan River with about 120,000 soldiers or so. Lee had 65,000. And the stakes for this battle couldn't have been higher. I recently just the other day, I was in Gettysburg, and I heard a presentation by Gary Gallagher, the famous historian, and he had changed his mind about Gettysburg and felt Gettysburg maybe wasn't quite the turning point that he had always thought it was, the hinge on the war. And I think the Wilderness is a great example of that, right? Because if it was inevitable that the South was going to lose after Gettysburg, well, then the Wilderness wouldn't have been quite the battle that it was, but it wasn't inevitable. The South had everything still to play for. And defeat of the Army of the Potomac, if Lee had been able to push Grant's army back across the Rapidan River, it would have been disastrous for the Union. And, Lincoln felt that, there's a good possibility that Lincoln may not have been reelected in November of 1864 had the spring campaign been a failure. And of course, for the South, it was simple. If Grant was able to destroy Lee's army, then it would be over for the Confederate States of America. But in any event, I think we all know what happened, and Lee surprised Grant in the Wilderness. They fought one of the most horrific battles of the Civil War, and the casualties for the Union were officially 17,666, but it's very likely the number was a lot higher than that. And for the Confederacy, we don't really have accurate numbers, but the best estimate that I've seen was maybe roughly 11,100 or so. So that's what happened. So now I'd like to talk about why I wrote this book. So ever since I was young, I had read a lot about the Civil War, and the Battle of the Wilderness just haunted me. Of all of the battles, it seemed the most horrific. And as you all know, fires broke out on several occasions during the battle, and it seemed like a especially horrific danger to face on the battlefield, in addition to getting shot and obviously suffering from wounds and what have you. According to one of the official medical officers, roughly 200 or so Union soldiers were killed by fire, and many more injured. It had been unseasonably hot. It was in the mid-90s, which in early May in Virginia is still hot, even though we're accustomed to hotter weather than, say, upstate New Yorkers or New Englanders. But it was hot, and the paper from the cartridges landed on the dry leaves, causing these fires in different locations. The soldiers had been especially fearful of fire, and fires had broke out a year earlier at Chancellorsville, and the night before the battle, I include an anecdote in my book of someone telling his comrades around a fire, that a campfire, that the next day they had to be careful, that this was a real danger. The image that I have here is from Alfred Wood, and some of you are probably familiar with it. It's called "The Army of the Potomac Are Wounded Escaping from the Fires of the Wilderness." And I think it's just an incredible image that I wanted to share with you. You can see some of the wounded on the ground, and the flames in the background kind of giving this incredibly horrific image. This eventually appeared as an engraving in Harper's Weekly just about a month later. And so that was one thing I wanted to write about. I wanted to tell a story kind of look this horror squarely in the eyes. It's just kind of really process it and at least tell it from the perspective of the soldiers. Another topic I wanted to explore in this book that often isn't given as much attention in sort of the traditional military history narratives was I wanted to look at the wounded. And one of the things that I do in this book is I explore the odyssey of what it was like for the wounded soldiers to be wounded in the wilderness and then be transported to first Fredericksburg and then up by steamer to the general hospitals of Washington, D.C. And what did that look like? Earlier in my life, I had read two Civil War classics, Reveille in Washington by Margaret Leach and A Stillness at Appomattox by Bruce Catton. And both of them talk a little bit about this. And I was struck by how horrible it was being in the wagons and being transported over these bad roads when you maybe had a broken leg or a serious bullet wound, and just the bumping up and down. One of the characters that I write about in the book, Private William Reeves, who we'll talk more about in a moment, he had a ball go through his cheekbones, right? The broken bones of the face would be particularly susceptible to that up and down bumping of being transported, and imagine the pain that is involved with that. So I wanted to take a closer look at that. In my chapter on this in the book, it's called The Great Army of the Wounded. And roughly 7,000 wounded soldiers were taken up to Fredericksburg. And the convoy was almost 7 miles long from it started in the wilderness and getting to Fredericksburg, 7 miles of wagons. And of course, those soldiers that were in decent enough shape to walk had to do so. So some of them obviously had to walk, but the more wounded soldiers, Private William Reeves was more than almost 100% in a wagon, probably with a couple of other soldiers, and probably doing the best he could with his face. It took 30 hours for the men to be transported to Fredericksburg from the wilderness. For all of them, took 30 hours, so it was quite an ordeal. Sadly, and I didn't go into as much detail in the book about this, but I wanted to mention it to this group anyway. 960 wounded men were left behind, that they were just deemed in such rough shape that they just didn't have room for them and didn't have the resources to take them. So imagine fighting for the future, fighting for the Republic in the wilderness, you're wounded and you're left behind. You're left behind most likely to die. The Union medical team was able to reach out to the Confederate hospitals who took these guys. The Union Army moved on to Spotsylvania Courthouse, so the Confederates were in control of this area, and these guys ended up in Confederate hospitals. The Union medical team was able to negotiate with them, and I think they were able to recover approximately 400, and the exact number in the records is 431. Probably several hundred of the ones that didn't get brought back after the fact died. So left behind and died in the wilderness. It's a sad story, and it tells you kind of how harsh and rough the circumstances of the fight, but also the treatment of the wounded was. Despite how bad the experience was of being wounded in 1864, it was even worse in 1862. So one of the things that happens in the wilderness is you see a lot of the reforms had come to fruition in 1864. And so you had, for example, you had a much more professional ambulance service. You had a much better field hospital operation to treat the men right after they were wounded in the field, and then they would, of course, be sent up to the general hospitals. In 1862, at the Second Battle of Bull Run, they had musicians serving kind of as ad hoc nurses, and you had drunken ambulance drivers drinking the whiskey that had been meant for the wounded. And then after the Second Battle of Bull Run, 3,000 wounded soldiers were just left suffering in the field for 3 days after the battle without any treatment whatsoever. So as bad as it was in the wilderness, it had gotten better. And so that's a story I tell in the book, and I think it's one that is it helps complete our understanding of what happened in the wilderness. But the final and something that I really struggled with, one of the reasons why I wanted to explore this book in the way that I did, and as you'll see if you read the book, it's not a traditional military history. I'm much more trying to tell a story, but the story is framed and informed by a famous quote by Frederick Douglass. And he delivered this at Arlington, and it really resonated with me. And he said, "We must never forget that victory to the rebellion meant death to the republic. We must never forget that the loyal soldiers who rest beneath this sod flung themselves between the nation and the nation's destroyers." So the reason why I thought that was important is that the Civil War is often presented in a way that both sides, North and South, Union and Confederate, were honorable. And of course, there's a lot of truth to that. But there's also a moral dimension to this war that Douglass points out at Arlington. Lincoln said in his second inaugural, "Both parties deprecated war, but one of them would make war rather than let the nation survive, and the other would accept war rather than let it perish." And the war came. And I think that that's important because I wanted to kind of look at this from a moral dimension. As you see in the book, I focus most on the Union experience, because the goal of that is to say, what did this cost? What did preserving the Union cost in terms of lives, in terms of resources, dedication? You had ordinary farm laborers and small town clerks volunteered, drafted, suffered, died under impossible conditions. Walt Whitman wrote, and I love this quote, I included at the beginning of the book, "Will the America of the future, will this vast, rich union ever realize what itself cost back there after all?" So, so that was, that was another part of this book, that it was to look at the cost, look at the suffering, but look at the sacrifice too, that went into preserving the Union. I'm going to go back. Oh, sorry, we'll get back to, I want to go back to, sorry, we'll just bear with me here. There we go. I wanted to go back to this one. So many soldiers in the wilderness, particularly the more literary and literate, but literary soldiers, often compared the Battle of the Wilderness to Dante's Inferno. And I kind of feel that that's a good metaphor. He says, so, like the Inferno, like our conception of hell, there's the flames and there's the suffering, but there's also the wilderness, like hell, was something that needed to be passed through. You had to pass through it to get to where you wanted to go. So in Dante's case, he needed to go through the Inferno to get to Paradiso. But in the case of the United States, we had to go through the Battle of the Wilderness to get to saving the Republic and preserving the Union. And hell, of course, is another aspect of this Dante metaphor. hell, of course, is a punishment, right? And for some people back then, not all, but some of them felt that, the Civil War was a punishment for all of those years of slavery. So the Union staff officer who later wrote a great book about the wilderness, Morris Schaff, he believed that was true, that the battle was in some ways a punishment. And I think that's a very 19th century viewpoint. Maybe not one that we would share today, though some of us do, but it certainly was something that they viewed then. And then so finally, before we go on, I just want to make one last point, and that is, it seems obvious to me that the trauma experienced in those woods had a huge effect on American society after the war, right? There was the death, the suffering, the violence, right? That these are not things that are easily swept away and forgotten. How could they not? How could they be, right? I have a hypothesis that some of that is still with us, some of that trauma is still with us today, right? And you see it in the fierceness of our debates over the Civil War and over Civil War memory, right? And once again, it's like it's hard to think that we were killing one another in a forest not too far from the nation's capital, and then have that just be something that you move on from without having it affect us in some way or another. So anyway, so that's why I wrote the book. Now I'd like to kind of talk a little bit about the clash versus Grant and Lee, which I think is, just such a timeless subject of interest to all of us. And the view of both generals, Lee and Grant, has really changed over time, right? With Lee, you have the creation of a lost cause myth, and we almost deified him for over a century, right? He literally could do no wrong, so much so that a lot of his disciples felt like, well, surely Lee couldn't have lost Gettysburg. And so they had to blame Longstreet because his stature had risen so high that he wasn't seen as almost mortal. He had these otherworldly powers. Grant's reputation has also ebbed and flowed, right? I think his contemporaries saw him as a hero, right? But just as the lost cause interpretation of the Civil War is gaining in supporters, Grant's reputation was going down, and he was seen as a butcher, and he was seen as someone like, well, of course he won. He had more resources and he had more men, and there was no thought to his strategy or his tactics. He was just a butcher, as I said. More recently, though, Grant has been rehabilitated. I think nowadays, most historians see Grant as a very talented commander who was the best Union general of the Civil War, and maybe one of the great generals in American history. So I think that, you have the ebbs and flows. I think Lee, we've seen his reputation be reevaluated as an individual, right? But I think his military track record is still held in high regard by most historians. So what I'd like to do in looking at the Lee versus Grant is just kind of look at some episodes that happened in the wilderness and have a few insights from what actually happened during those episodes. So the first one is the famous Lee to the rear episode, and I have an image of it up on the screen right now. And essentially, the Lee to the rear is something people, if they know anything about the Battle of the Wilderness, that's probably one of the things they know. And just to give you a quick background, as most of you know, Lee had spent most of his day, most of May 5th, with A.P. Hill's troops at the intersection of the Orange Plank Road and the Brock Road. And despite being undermanned, the Confederates fought quite well on the first day. The problem is that at the end of the first day, Hill allowed his men to just sleep where they lay. And he figured Longstreet would be up in the morning, they'd they'd be able to sort things out, but his men were tired and he didn't spend any time reorganizing his units and preparing for what was an inevitable Union attack in the morning of May 6th. So unfortunately for Hill and for Lee, who approved that decision, Longstreet was late on the morning of the 6th, and just as inevitably as it was suspected, Hancock's corps and army troops attacked early and drove Hill's men backwards and into a retreat. And for a moment, it looked like Lee's army was going to be annihilated, because if Hill's corps was destroyed, and Longstreet wouldn't have been able to set up, and it would have been a knock-on effect of disaster. But just when it looked like all was lost, Longstreet arrived, right? And the Texas Brigade comes marching in across Widow Tapp's field, and Lee emotionally tries to lead the Texas Brigade at this crucial hour in the early morning of May 6th. And fortunately, he was prevented from leading the army, from leading the brigade. And the Texas Brigade eventually lost 457 men out of a total of 850. So it would have been disastrous. And it's very likely Lee would have been a casualty if he had tried. And you can see that image of sort of Lee trying to lead the men. He looks kind of like an Old Testament character, or at least a medieval knight going into battle. Longstreet said that by this point, Lee was off his balance. That's how Longstreet described it. And I just think that that's just a crucial moment in the fight. And I love this image that I'm sharing with you. It's kind of a little bit over stylized, right? But it shows Lee as this kind of Christ-like figure leading his men. And the irony of the lead of the rear episode, though, and it's, this thing that we remember, is that Lee was actually quite emotional, right? We often see him as the cool commander who always was very controlled emotionally, but here he's extremely emotional. And some described him as even in tears at that moment, that everything was so in the balance, so to speak. And Grant later in his memoirs kind of got a dig at Lee for this. Grant is writing in the memoirs about Sidney Johnston, who also tried to lead a brigade at the Battle of Shiloh, right? And just to paraphrase Grant, Grant said, hey, if things have gotten so bad that your commanding officer, your commanding general needs to lead a brigade into battle, well, then things are not going well for you. So it's kind of a nice dig that Grant is getting in. But I share this episode with you because I also think that it points to Lee's leadership abilities, that his soldiers remembered that lead of the rear episode because later in the decades after it happened, because it showed that not only was Lee brave enough to risk his life, but he almost shared in the experience of the ordinary soldiers. They respected him for that, but also they wanted to protect him because they knew that he was essential for victory. And so I think that bond, whatever else you might say about Lee, and I think that there's a good debate along a lot of different topics to be had, but I think that it's hard to criticize his leadership abilities, and that helps explain the kind of Lee myth, I think, after the war. One final thing, and we'll move on to Grant, but one final thing is that the lead of the rear episode has actually been in the news recently. Some of you may know that there's been a controversy over this fight song at the University of Texas called The Eyes of Texas. And apparently the Eyes of Texas, it was thought, was something related to what Lee said after the war when he was university president at what is now Washington and Lee. And apparently it was thought he said something like, "The eyes of the South are upon you," and that became "The Eyes of Texas are upon you," and then that became the song for the University of Texas. But in fact, The Eyes of Texas comes directly from the Lee to the Rear episode. And just before the Texas Brigade goes into action, their commander, John Gregg says, "Attention Texas Brigade, the eyes of General Lee are upon you." And then it becomes, many decades later, becomes the Texas Fight Song. I think that that's relevant today because that link with Lee was enough to cause some students to want to abolish that Eyes of Texas Fight Song, for other reasons too, because it was originally performed by white students in blackface, and it came from that sort of tradition of late 19th, early 20th century South. But nonetheless, I think that connection with Lee in some ways tainted it. And once again, it raises the moral dimension of the war, but also just the fact that the wilderness is still with us today in that one instance. So now I want to talk a little bit about Grant. And so like Lee's Lee to the Rear episode, Grant is also remembered for his famous moment in the wilderness, his night march to Spotsylvania Courthouse. And during the afternoon of May 6th, when the Union fortunes looked at their worst, Grant decided that they were going to keep going south the next day, and they were only getting started. And it's really, I think, one of the crucial decisions of the entire Civil War. And I think it highlights some of Grant's great strengths as a commander, but also as a leader. The Union Army had had horrific casualties over the 2 days in the wilderness, and it had its left was almost turned on the in the midday on the May 6th, and its right was almost turned at near sundown on May 6th. It had suffered incredibly and had not really made much headway. Earlier, with similar losses, a year previously, General Hooker had retreated across the Rappahannock and had had enough. But with Grant, he was just getting started. And I write in my book, I say, unlike General Hooker at Chancellorsville, who had said he lost faith in Joe Hooker, Grant never lost faith in himself or the campaign. And I think that that's just incredibly important about Grant, right? That the other commanders, George McClellan, he takes a lot of heat, but he has some great strengths as an administrator and as a leader, but he didn't have that ability to stick with the battle when things looked like they could go either way in the way that Grant could. Certainly Hooker and Burnside couldn't. So I think that's something that Grant brings to it. And I think that that element of the Grant myth, that he sticks with something and he won't let go, is true. I mean, there's a lot of truth in that. So I think I'll maybe conclude that point is that, both Lee and Grant had moments in the wilderness that would eventually play a big part in their legacies, right? Lee, who had that strong bond with his men, the Army of Northern Virginia, and Grant, that persistence, that doggedness, that moral courage that maybe some of the other commanders of the Army of the Potomac lacked. So I think that that's one thing. And there's a great image, I think, of Grant. This is the night of May 7th, right before the night march, and you can see the troops cheering. Grant is in the middle on his horse, on horseback. You can see kind of the smoke in the background. Anyway, I love this sketch of him. So I think I'll stop there. I'll maybe conclude this comparison of Grant and Lee, that both of them were quite rivalrous of each other after the war. They knew, let's be clear, they knew each other was the other's greatest rival during the war. But at one point, Grant was asked about Lee, and Grant referred to him as a headquarters general. And he was a man who needed sunshine. So he's kind of taking a dig at Lee, and then Grant says, I was much more concerned with Joseph Johnston. I don't think that's true for a minute, but I think it shows you how he saw Lee as such a rival that he kind of wanted to minimize Lee's legacy by pointing to Johnston as his biggest rival. And Lee did the same thing. And he said, he was asked who his greatest rival was during the war, and he told his nephew, oh, it was McClellan. So I just think it's interesting that these two talented, also very competitive men had that view of one another. All right, so now I want to take a little bit of time and talk about the ordinary soldier. And the way, one of the things I often think about is what it must have been like to be an ordinary Union soldier on the eve of the Overland Campaign. Imagine yourself on May 4th or May 3rd in 1864. They were about to, once the wilderness begins, these ordinary soldiers would experience almost 40 days of constant combat, from the wilderness through Spotsylvania Courthouse and then on to Cold Harbor. 40 days of constant combat. Getting killed was obviously very likely, and also the worst outcome. It goes without saying for these guys, these Union soldiers. So they had to worry about being killed, and many of them would be killed. But it was even worse than that, because there's a great book by Drew Gilpin Faust called This Republic of Suffering. And back then, the ideal death was to die at home, surrounded by your family, and maybe being on your deathbed and having some final words, and then being buried nearby so people could visit you. So imagine the trauma of dying in the woods of the wilderness, alone, unknown, and perhaps not ever found. That was actually a truly kind of horrific thing for them. And so they worried about it, and it also did happen. Another of the fears facing these ordinary soldiers on the eve of the Overland Campaign, what happens if we get wounded? In addition to the pain of being wounded and the ordeal of these awful 19th century treatments, you could face an infection, or in the case of Private William Reeves, you would have what's called a secondary hemorrhage, meaning that the artery breaks shortly after surgery or after your treatment, and then you die a week later afterwards. So being wounded was not in any event, was not something that would not necessarily eventually lead to death. So being killed, obviously the worst, being wounded, not much better. And then you might get taken prisoner, and the ordeal of the prisoners in the spring of 1864 was horrific. At that time, they were taking them, many of them, to Andersonville Prison, where 13,000 Union prisoners would die in 1864 and 1865. Most of the deaths at Andersonville were from scurvy and from bowel disease. So they were pretty awful deaths, right? So there were some people that said, you know what, I'd rather be killed in the field than have to go through the ordeal of being captured. So it was that bad. It was not something, a regimental historian wrote of Andersonville that it was a story of cruelties, starvation, vermin, heartless disregard of life, and unparalleled diabolism, which puts to blush every loyal man. So these are some of the things that these guys faced on the eve of the Overland Campaign. I have, just as a lighthearted thing, some of you may have remember a football coach named Woody Hayes, who coached Ohio State. And Ohio State, Woody Hayes allegedly said, I don't know if he actually said this or not, but he allegedly said, there are 3 things that can happen when you throw a pass, and 2 of them are bad, right? Well, similarly, on the eve of the Overland Campaign, there were 4 things that could happen to the Union soldier, right? Being killed, being wounded, being captured, or surviving, right? There were 4 things that could happen to you, and 3 of them were bad, right? So, so this is what these guys faced, and you can imagine, not only was it pretty scary, right? But many of them bravely went forward and did what they could do to save the Republic. So now I'd like to talk about one of the main characters, Private William Reeves. And I'm not related to Private William Reeves, but I chose him for this book because he was someone who was wounded in the wilderness, and I was able to get access to his military records, right? He was wounded in the wilderness, and he was taken up to first Fredericksburg and later to Stanton General Hospital in Washington, D.C. And then eventually he died there, and he's buried in Arlington Cemetery. And he was one of the first burials at Arlington National Cemetery. In fact, he was the fourth burial. And he was the first individual who had been wounded in a battle. He was the first to be buried at Arlington. The reason why I was carefully choosing my words is that the first battlefield casualty was right before Reeves. He was the third one at Arlington, but Reeves had been wounded before him, but he lasted about 8 days before 9 days actually before he was buried, and the other person had been wounded on May 10th and was the third burial. So in any event, one of the earliest burials. And I thought, what a great thread to tell the story that I wanted to tell. This individual who he literally was wounded at the opening engagement in the woods just south of the turnpike. So he was in the first assault. He was wounded at that time, and then of course he's treated in the field hospitals. He's brought to Fredericksburg, up to DC, dies, buried in Arlington, and you have that nice thread to be able to tell the story. And so that's William Reeves. Unfortunately, I don't have his memoirs. There's no letters of him. But I did get his military file, so I did know quite a bit about his, just kind of some details, military details. And he was a substitute. He had received $300 plus a bounty of about $75, and he served as a substitute for an individual named Hiram Hezekiah Humphrey, and they were both from Victor, New York, in upstate New York. Reeves was only 19 years old when he took on this job as a substitute, and he earned a little money. Maybe he hoped to retire, move back to upstate New York and buy a farm. He got married right before he enlisted. And so he enlists in, and I go into some of these private details in the book, but he enlists in August of 1863, right after the Battle of Gettysburg. And when he enlists as a substitute, he gets married to his wife, Anna, and Anna was from England, an English immigrant, and then he joins and he goes out to the field, and the Battle of the Wilderness is for the most part his first combat. Reeves was so green that he was part of the 76th New York Infantry Regiment, but he served on a separate detachment for a lot of late 1863 and early 1864, guarding the supply trains. And so he didn't really see much action until the Wilderness. He probably hadn't been that well trained either. They didn't want to waste ammunition on these young boys, so practicing. So he probably didn't have much training and much marksmanship. He was literally the rawest of raw recruits when he went into those woods. I go into a little detail in the book about his wounding. As I said, the ball went in the left cheek and came out the right one, and it was pretty kind of gruesome injury. In technical terms, he had received a compound comminuted fracture of the inferior maxilla by a conoidal ball, which entered the left cheek ½ inch anterior to the right angle of the jaw and emerged at a point nearly opposite. More simply, it was a smaller wound on entering and then a much bigger one as it exited. So his face would have been quite messy. For this book, I consulted with a doctor about the medical file, and we went into the file in some detail, and I was able to write with a little more authority than I would have on my own by having a doctor who was able to explain to me some of what precisely happened. One of the things that he did have was in the field hospital, he had a surgery where they removed the bone fragments from the mouth and from the wounds. But unfortunately now, back then they didn't have x-rays, right? So the only way that they could remove the fragments is with their eyes and with their fingers to see. Unfortunately, you're only going to get so much. You're only going to be able to see so much that way, right? So more likely than not, there was some sort of smaller fragment that they weren't able to see that would eventually nick his artery and cause what the secondary hemorrhage that I mentioned earlier. And so when he got the secondary hemorrhage on May 12th, so he'd already gotten up to DC and was at Stanton General Hospital. He was being treated. He experiences a secondary hemorrhage. They immediately tried to tie the artery with their hands using thread, but that procedure failed. Reeves suffered a lot of shock and died afterwards. And he died at 4 a.m. on Friday, May 13th, 1864. And on the following day, on May 14th, as I said, he became the fourth soldier buried at Arlington. Interestingly enough, the Union Army, after the Battle of the Wilderness, had gone on to Spotsylvania Courthouse, and on May 12th had fought the Battle of the Bloody Angle, which ended in the wee hours of May 13th, which is when Reeves died. So I thought there was a little bit of poetry there, obviously coincidental, but nonetheless, you have this, fight for the Union, fight to the finish at the Bloody Angle, which was a horrific violence that day, and Reeves dying at about the same time. Reeves's grave is located in section 27 of Arlington today. You can see it right there. It's still there. You can visit it if you ever go to Arlington. And section 27 is where African Americans and African American troops and African American soldiers were eventually buried. So initially, Union soldiers like Reeves, white Union soldiers like Reeves, a handful, 10 or 12 or so, had been buried in section 27. But then Montgomery Meigs had said, no, I want the soldiers buried closer to Lee's house, so he'll never come back there again, because this was Robert E. Lee's former estate, obviously. And then when they started burying the white Union soldiers closer to the Lee estate, they used section 27 for African American troops and also African American civilians who lived nearby in Arlington and Alexandria. I have a whole chapter devoted to the foundation of Arlington, which I think is connected to these events of the Overland Campaign. So we've gotten to the end. I want to leave some time for questions. And maybe I'll stop with this one last point, and then I'm happy to stay on for questions if you're all able to. There was a sad story about Reeves's father, Theophilus Reeves, and apparently when his son William died, Theophilus, an elderly man, joined the Union Army so he could go off to Virginia in search of his boy, William, and because William had died or gone missing and he didn't know where he was. That actually appeared in a book, A History of Ontario County, New York and Its People in 1911. That story is not true. and it couldn't be, because we know that Reeves, the authorities knew that Reeves died. His widow applied for a pension and received it a week after his death. And his widow lived in the same town as his father. So it was actually another Theophilus in another regiment at another time. So anyway, I'll close on that point, and we'll have some time for some questions.
We don't have any questions yet. Does anyone? Okay, Greg Major has raised his hand.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I can.
Okay. One of the things, and because I have a degree in history from a small Catholic university down in Austin, Texas, one of the things that they mentioned, which I thought was really ironic, was the fact that a lot of the Union troops also wanted to go ahead and be known after they died. And what they did was they went ahead and got their name and actually a piece of thread and actually sewed their name in their uniforms. Just a small point.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that fear of being unknown and being lost to their families is something that is really meaningful, about the ordinary soldier's experience. And the wilderness was especially bad for that, right? Because of the nature of the terrain. It could very easy to go missing in those woods. Yeah.
All right. Well, with that, I would like to thank John for a very interesting presentation, and I do recommend his book to you. It's not a thick volume, but it has a lot of information in it, and I learned a lot and got a perspective, especially as he emphasized, from the private soldier angle. And so with that, I'd thank you all for joining, and have a good day. And hopefully all of you will, in this a little bit looser times with respect to the COVID environment, can spend safe times with some of your family this coming week. So thank you very much. And
I just wanted to thank John for his excellent presentation. Very thorough. A lot of us are quite familiar with the Battle of Wilderness, living right next to it, obviously. So I think you covered it very, very well. Thanks a lot.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, everyone. Have a good day.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
I'll see you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, John. Thank you for watching this video to the end. We encourage you to visit our website, civilwarstudygroup.org, frequently, as we make every attempt to keep it up to date.